Firefighters extinguish a blazing house in the nick of time, exposing the murders the fire was meant to conceal. A woman's death in her bathtub looks like an accident, at least at first. Investigating a reported suicide, police in New Orleans find certain details suspiciously out of place. Killers can be masters at disguising their crimes, even when their victims are in plain sight. It takes a vigilant investigator to realize that first impressions are often dead wrong. In the small town of Vinton, Virginia, on August 29, 1994, a passing motorist saw smoke rising from a house just before dawn. Firefighters battled the blaze for several hours before bringing it under control.
Okay, can you give me your status? You making any headway on the fire? Yeah, we got most of it knocked down. We're still negative on a search.
The patterns of the burns and the speed at which the fire spread told them this was arson. Had the motorist not called when he did, the house and all it contained would have been destroyed beyond recognition. The fire team was not in time to save the family who lived there. 4 people, including 2 small children, were dead.
11th, go ahead and back your hay line out of the building.
But once the smoke cleared and smoldering ruins were examined, it became apparent that this family did not die in the fire. Downstairs, Teresa Hodges had been strangled. Upstairs, 11-year-old Winter Hodges and 3-year-old Anna Hodges had been shot. In the master bedroom, the body of their father, Blaine Hodges, was found with a single gunshot to the head. A .22 caliber pistol without a barrel lay near his body. Special Agent Barry Cassie of the Virginia State Police had a theory about what happened.
It was pretty obvious that the evidence was just screaming. That's the words I use of murder-suicide. And as the morning wore on, it became even more evident that it was a murder-suicide.
Blaine Hodges had recently been convicted of embezzling from his employer, the United States Postal Service. Police believed that Blaine, despondent over his impending prison sentence, had killed his wife and his children. Then he doused their home with fuel oil, set it afire, and shot himself in the head. At autopsy, Dr. David Oxley, Deputy Chief Medical Examiner of Western Virginia, began to doubt the murder-suicide theory.
Well, when I examined the bodies, all 4 of the bodies, I noticed the thing that struck me was that the man, Blaine Hodges, had been dead considerably longer than the other 3. The body of Mr. Hodges was quite decomposed. The other bodies were not. What do we know so far?
Oxley told Special Agent Cassie that Blaine Hodges couldn't have killed his family.
24 to 36 hours, find out what
He'd died at least 12 hours earlier than they did. The gun collected at the scene also raised questions. The bullets retrieved from the victims were all .22 caliber, the same as the pistol retrieved next to Blaine Hodges. The pistol's serial number had been filed off, making it impossible to trace. Its missing barrel also hampered investigators. A gun barrel leaves spiral marks called lands and grooves on every bullet that passes through. The bullets recovered from the victims had these markings, meaning they came from a gun with a barrel. Forensic Supervisor William Conrad of the Virginia Division of Forensic Science was convinced that someone besides Blaine Hodges must have pulled the trigger.
With the barrel removed and rifling being present on the father's bullet that was taken from his head, would indicate right away that he could not have fired that shot. There's no way he could have shot himself in the head and then removed the barrel. That wouldn't have happened.
Conrad wasn't convinced this was even the real murder weapon. The bullets taken from the bodies were marked with 6 lands and grooves. Reference manuals for the gun found at the crime scene showed its normal pattern would be 8 lands and grooves. Conrad concluded the gun found at the crime scene was merely a drop gun, intended to fool the police.
At a crime scene, if you're trying to frame someone or try to cover something up, you would drop a gun that's unrelated to the incident and try to trick us into thinking that was the actual weapon.
What looked like a murder-suicide at the crime scene had morphed into plain murder in the forensics lab. Aside from tipping detectives off, the gun was of little use at this stage in the investigation. They had no suspects, no ballistics to compare, and apparently not even the murder weapon. All that detectives could be sure of was that someone else had killed the family, then tried to make it appear like murder-suicide. The killer had hoped the flames would consume the evidence. Detectives sifting through the ashes at the crime scene now had a new assignment: to smoke out the killer. Police had no idea who killed the Hodges and their 2 daughters. They questioned friends, hoping to gather clues about their enemies. Their closest friend was a man named Earl Bramblett. He frequently stayed with the family. The kids called him Uncle Earl. Police asked Bramblett to come to the station and talk with them. He seemed genuinely upset about the deaths. But in the course of his interview, an offhanded comment caught investigators by surprise.
He spontaneously made a comment, and he said that sorry SOB, he had a beautiful family, he did them and did himself. Well, at that moment, I knew Mr. Bramblett was probably involved in the murders of the Hodges family. I knew that in order for somebody to know that outside of the police, that they would have had to have been in there when the murders occurred.
The media hadn't reported the murder-suicide story, and the police hadn't mentioned it to anyone outside of the force. Bramblett had revealed a detail only the killer would have known. Gussie kept his suspicions to himself. He needed more evidence before he could act on them. Bramblett agreed to come in for another interview later. When he failed to show, the police went to the motel where he was staying, since he had no fixed address. When he didn't answer the door, the detectives obtained a room key from the motel manager to make sure he was all right. Bramblett arrived just in time to stop them. Now belligerent, he dared them to place him under arrest. To the police, he was behaving like a man who was guilty.
You want to arrest? You think I've done something wrong?
And who believed the police would never be able to prove it. Bramblett's own words had made him a suspect, but words alone proved nothing. 3 days after the Hodges family were killed, police set up a roadblock in front of the house. The fire had started around 4:30 a.m. By stopping cars around that time, they hoped to find someone who may have passed the house just before it burned. A woman told police she saw a vehicle pull out of the Hodges' driveway at the time of the fire. She noticed the vehicle because it was so unusual, an old white pickup truck with a black tailgate. She did not notice the license number or the driver.
Earl, said we'd be back. A search warrant to look at your truck and your room. Can I read it?
While the roadblock was taking place, police returned to Bramblett's motel room with a search warrant. As Bramblett stood by, they searched for anything that might suggest his involvement in the deaths of Blaine Hodges and his family. Outside stood his white pickup truck with its distinctive black tailgate. In the front seat, police saw several .22 caliber shell casings. They were the same brand and caliber as the casings found at the murder scene. When the firing pin strikes a bullet, it leaves a distinct impression on the cartridge casing. William Conrad hoped to compare the casings from the crime scene with the ones found in Bramblett's truck. Once again, he found the killer was one step ahead of him. He'd obscured the marks on the cartridges.
It looked like someone had placed it in, fired the gun, took them out, placed them again, and fired them. Again, it indicated that someone was trying to manipulate the evidence after the fact to try to confuse the laboratory and what was going on.
Conrad would not be so easily thwarted. Among the hash of wayward marks, he looked for similarities between the cartridges retrieved from the truck and those from the murder scene.
We can put the marks together, see the reproducible patterns that are present, and be able to say that the marks that you see represented on both of them were made by the same firing pin impression.
After close scrutiny, he found what he was looking for. One of the cartridges from the crime scene had a strike mark identical to a cartridge from Bramblett's truck.
And I found enough of those individual characteristics that I was able to say that both of them had been fired by the same firing pin, to the exclusion of any others.
The cartridge casings were definitely used in the same gun, linking the drop gun to Bramblett. But that wasn't enough. Conrad still needed to find the gun that fired the fatal bullets. Meantime, detectives worked the case from another angle, trying to find out if Bramblett could have been the one who set the fire. The killer had torched the house around 4:30 a.m. on Monday, August 29th. To check Bramblett's whereabouts at that time, police went to the sign company where he worked. They learned he was scheduled to be at work at 5 a.m. the day of the fire.
The same employee that routinely checks the time cards checked Mr. Bramlett's. Mr. Bramlett's card had been obliterated. That the time that he punched in on Monday morning, August the 29th, had been blacked out where you couldn't read what time he might have punched in.
Police called on handwriting expert Gordon Menzies to find out what was under the marking.
Using infrared lighting techniques, I was able to separate the ink of the overwritten entry or the obliterating entry and come up with an entry of 5:08 M, which was apparently 8 minutes after 5 Monday.
The time card confirmed that Bramblett arrived at work after the blaze was set. But that didn't prove he was the one who set it. It only proved he had time to do it. The search for more evidence continued. Bramblett's employer told police that the morning after police searched Bramblett's motel room, Earl arrived at work seething with rage. 1 hour later, a co-worker noticed water running under a door. He found a pair of blue jeans thought to be Bramblett's. They smelled of the solvent used at the sign company. The manager thought them important enough to turn over to the police. Authorities hoped the jeans still held some clue to link Bramblett to the fire. Scientists analyzed them and the water they were soaking in. To identify the chemicals in the fabric, the jeans were placed in a canister with a solvent called pentane. After they had soaked for 15 minutes, the pentane was poured off. The solvent evaporated under a fume hood, leaving behind a soup of the compounds from the jeans. The liquid was placed in a gas chromatograph. A readout identified each compound soaked out of the jeans. One was a commercial solvent used by the sign company. The other was fuel oil, like that used to douse the home of the murder victims. Investigators believed that Bramblett had tried to rinse the oil-soaked jeans clean, carelessly leaving them where anyone could find them. Though the jeans were potential evidence, they were, like everything else so far, circumstantial. Investigators pressed on. Hoping that Bramblett's carelessness didn't stop there, they looked for more evidence in the dumpster at the sign company. Along with documents belonging to Bramblett, they found a T-shirt bearing the words William Byrd High School, class of 2001. One of the murder victims, 11-year-old Winter Hodges, owned such a T-shirt. It was missing from the crime scene and unaccounted for. The shirt found in the dumpster had apparently belonged to the victim. Investigators were encouraged. Only Bramblett would have had access to both the shirt and the dumpster. Still, it proved no wrongdoing. As the investigation into the deaths of the Hodges continued, Bramblett left town for good. Though Virginia police never let him out of their sight, they believed they had nothing to hold him. They didn't realize they had what they needed all along. Police were reasonably certain that Earl Bramblett killed the Hodges family, but that means nothing in a court of law. To prove it, they had to place him at the scene. The gun seemed to be the crucial element. They just didn't know how it fit. The killer had taken pains to make sure the weapon couldn't be identified. Without a serial number, it couldn't be traced. Without a barrel, investigators had no way to perform a ballistics test. They had no reason to believe that the gun from the crime scene was the murder weapon. According to William Conrad's reference manual, a bullet fired from this gun would show 8 lands and grooves. The bullets recovered from the Hodges showed only 6. The weapon sat on a shelf for a year while the case against Bramblett stalled. Then, on an unrelated investigation, Conrad ran across a weapon of the same brand as the gun in the Bramblett case. He test-fired the gun and was surprised to find that the bullets had 6 lands and grooves instead of 8. The reference manual had been wrong. Conrad now knew that the gun found in the Hodges house most likely was the murder weapon. The killer had removed its barrel because he thought it would make the gun untraceable. But through the cartridge casings and other forensic evidence, police found their man. By linking the gun to Earl Bramblett, the police had gathered the final piece of evidence they needed to prove he was the killer. Then, his sister in Indiana provided information about the possible motive. Bramblett, apparently feeling threatened, had sent her a huge number of audio tapes for safekeeping. He told her to send them to police if something happened to him. When she heard her brother was in trouble, she forwarded them to the Virginia authorities. In his audio-taped diaries, Bramblett spoke of his more than casual attraction to the Hodges' 11-year-old daughter. Bramblett had once been a suspect in the disappearance of 2 small children, but his involvement had never been proved. According to the tapes, Bramblett began to believe that Blaine Hodges, faced with prison for embezzling, had become a police informant. In his delusions, Bramblett had decided Blaine was using his daughter to entrap Bramblett as a child molester. The police believed that on Saturday, August 27, 1994, Bramblett had been visiting Blaine at his home. While Teresa Hodges and her children were out shopping, he took his .22 Magnum pistol and shot Blaine in the head. According to friends who saw them later that day, Bramblett told Teresa when she came home from shopping that Blaine, despondent over going to prison, needed some time by himself.
Blaine took off.
Like the good uncle he pretended to be, he bundled Teresa and the children into his truck and took them camping in the nearby mountains. As Blaine Hodges lay dead in an upstairs bedroom, his wife and children went off with his killer. They would have only a 24-hour reprieve. The next day, Bramblett would resume his killing by strangling Teresa Hodges. Having killed both parents, Bramblett saved his last horrifying act of violence for the children. He then put the murder weapon next to Blaine Hodges' body to make it appear that Blaine had killed his family, then himself. He was sure the fuel he spread throughout the house would ignite an all-consuming fire, that the police would buy the theory of murder-suicide. But Bramblett had no sooner made his getaway than a passing motorist spotted the flames and called the fire department. Special Agent Barry Cassie acknowledges that Bramblett almost got away with it.
But his primary plan was, if the police buy this murder-suicide, I'm home free. And look, he would have been home free. But see, he did not know that the Benton Fire Department had responded in such a short order that they preserved the bodies upstairs.
It took the police almost 2 years to build their case. Bramblett had relocated to South Carolina, but the Virginia authorities had never lost his trail. He was arrested in July 1996, convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Killers can disguise their crimes in many ways, but the truth often lies just below the surface. On April 29, 1997, police in the suburban Philadelphia community of Marion, Pennsylvania, arrived at the house of Craig Rabinowitz. He'd called 911 to report his wife unconscious in the bathtub. They found Rabinowitz clutching his wife Stephanie, still in the tub where he'd found her. He told police he'd discovered his wife on her side, her head underwater. He had no idea what caused his wife to drown. Paramedics tried to revive her, but she was dead. Detective Charlie Craig saw no signs of foul play in the death of Mrs. Rabinowitz.
My initial impression of the cause of death, after looking at Stephanie, after viewing her at the emergency ward, and after talking with the emergency ward doctor, was that it was an unexplained death or it was an accident.
All right, here we go.
What are you doing?
Oh, come on.
Friends and relatives mourned the untimely death of a woman in the prime of life. Craig and Stephanie had met when he was a camp counselor and she was still a teenager. After they married, Stephanie went to law school and had a promising career as an attorney. To their friends, they seemed an ideal couple. Now, their happiness had come to a tragic end. Craig told police that on the night of his wife's death, he was watching a hockey game while she took a bath. He heard a thump coming from the bathroom, like the sound of a shampoo bottle hitting the floor. When his wife failed to emerge from the bath after 35 minutes, he went to check on her. That's when he found her submerged in the water, her face blue. He tried desperately to bring her back to life, then called 911. Detectives have an eye for inconsistencies. And though they had no reason to doubt that the death was an accident, one fact seemed bothersome. The paramedics mentioned that the victim was wearing jewelry, including a watch. Charlie Craig's partner, Detective Richard Peffel, asked some of his female friends if they bathed with their jewelry.
And almost exclusively, every woman said, absolutely not. The first one I did was the first night I got home about 4 a.m. and I woke up my wife from a dead sleep. Nance, if you took a bath, would you wear all of your jewelry? And she looked at me and said, no, why? And I said, don't worry about it, go back to sleep.
That eccentric detail motivated investigators to look for other inconsistencies. They checked the hospital records. Again, something didn't sit right. After death, a body's temperature normally drops at the rate of 1 degree per hour, even faster if it's sitting in water. When the victim arrived at the hospital, her temperature was only 1 degree below normal, indicating she died just 10 minutes before the call to 911. Her husband's estimate that 35 minutes passed after he heard a thump in the bathroom didn't add up. While detectives' suspicions were mounting, Chief Coroner Halbert Fillinger requested an autopsy to find out why the healthy 29-year-old died so suddenly. Craig Rabinowitz refused to allow it, asserting that Jewish law demands that the body be interred before sundown the day after death, and it must remain intact. But in cases of mysterious or sudden death, the coroner can overrule religious objections unless he's given a court order.
Because of their Jewish faith, Stephanie should have been buried before the next sundown. And Dr. Fillinger was pressured by the family to release Stephanie's body so that she could be buried in accordance with her faith. And Dr. Fillinger was persistent that the body would not be released until a complete autopsy was committed.
When the body was brought in, it showed no marks, not even a bruise to indicate how the victim fell. According to Fillinger, that's not unusual.
There are injuries on the front of the body, and they occurred just prior to death or a short time prior to death. And you examine the body right after death, you may not see anything at all.
But by the time the autopsy was conducted, 12 hours after she died, the victim's wounds began to reveal themselves and the truth about her death. The medical examiners believed they were about to begin a routine autopsy on the victim of a mysterious death. Though the circumstances were tragic, examiners didn't expect them to be criminal. But they soon found themselves face to face with homicide. The first indication of foul play came with a look at the skin below the victim's eyes, where bruises made a silent accusation.
But as the blood drains away from those sites of injury, leaving the surrounding skin quite pale, then the area of bruising stands up like a beacon in the night.
Bruises such as these come from lack of oxygen, most often when a victim chokes or is choked. Strangulation was a possibility worth looking into. The victim showed no external marks around her neck, but beneath the skin, the tissue damage confirmed Fillinger's suspicions.
And of course, when we first got the body open, we found the evidence of severe strangulation, a great deal of trauma in the neck.
The mystery of Stephanie Rabinowitz's sudden death had been solved, and a homicide investigation had begun. Detectives Charlie Craig and Richard Peffel, along with prosecutor Bruce Castor, had their prime suspect, the victim's husband, Craig Rabinowitz. They questioned him in the presence of his attorney.
When Charlie came back in and advised both Rabinowitz and the attorney that Stephanie had in fact died from manual strangulation, the attorney jumped up and said, "Oh my God, she strangled herself." And both Charlie and I looked at the attorney and I said, I don't think so.
The Rabinowitz marriage seemed picture perfect. What could have driven Craig Rabinowitz to kill his wife? Police obtained a warrant to search the house for some sign of a motive. While his wife worked as a lawyer, Craig had supposedly run a business from his home. He convinced a number of his friends to invest in his promising venture. But a search of the house showed no evidence of a business being conducted there. Detectives had almost given up when one of the officers found a plastic bag in a crawl space above a closet. The bag was filled with receipts and financial records. They revealed that Craig Rabinowitz had been living a lie.
When we went through the bag, we found some pretty important items, including a list or a ledger. We also found other receipts from pawn shops, indicating that some jewelry had recently been pawned. And we also found receipts from furniture stores, the furniture that he had bought, apparently another woman. So during this whole case, he was pictured to be this loving, happy, devoted husband, and in this bag, we found otherwise.
A forensic accountant, skilled in deciphering complex financial transactions, reviewed the records. He found that what Craig had called a business was in fact a con game. He'd swindled his investors and convinced his trusting wife to remortgage their home. He then spent the money not on business, but to support his secret life. Credit card bills totaling $54,000 came from a single location, a strip club in Philadelphia. He'd been seeing one of the dancers there, showering her with gifts. At the time of his wife's death, Craig was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Desperate for money, Craig had taken out 2 insurance policies, each for $1.5 million. One was for his own life, the other for his wife. In a ledger found in the attic, Craig had calculated his net worth in the event his wife died, proving the crime was premeditated. After collecting on the insurance and paying off his debts, he'd have $1.2 million to spare. At the end of his rope, Craig turned on his unsuspecting wife and strangled her to death. He filled the bathtub, hoping to create the appearance of an accidental drowning. Then he called the police. It seemed like such a simple plan. According to Charlie Craig, far too simple.
A lot of people said to me, you know, this guy must have seen this in a movie or read it in a book. Well, as it was coming close to trial, that kind of stuck in my mind, and I got the photos back out because I remember there was some book that had something to do with death.
A book on Rabinowitz's desk had looked out of place when police searched his home. The author claimed that few deaths are followed by an autopsy.
Craig Rabinowitz was a con man. When he learned this information, that only 13% of the deaths are autopsied, Craig Rabinowitz was playing a con. He was playing the odds when he learned that information, that the odds were dramatically in his favor that Stephanie wouldn't be autopsied.
But an autopsy had been performed, exposing Craig Rabinowitz as a con man who'd gotten in too deeply. For murdering his wife, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lurid events take on a life of their own. On the streets of any town, people love a good scandal, especially when it involves respectable citizens. In New Orleans, a town not easily shocked, investigators found themselves in the middle of a scandal that made the Big Easy a little queasy. Just after dawn on January 22, 1984, 62-year-old Aaron Mintz frantically summoned his neighbor, a doctor. Mintz explained that his wife had just shot herself. The two men rushed upstairs to the master bedroom. There, the doctor found Pam Mintz lying face up on her pillow, a bullet hole in the right side of her head. In her hand was a pistol. The doctor checked for vital signs as Mintz waited anxiously nearby. Solemnly, the doctor informed Aaron Mintz that Pam Mintz, the woman he'd been married to for 33 years, was dead. The doctor called the police to notify them of the suicide. They arrived to make a report. Detective John Dillman led the investigation.
Shortly before daybreak, or right at dawn, I received the call of a suicide at the residence of Aaron Mintz. Proceeded to that location, thinking that I was going to handle a suicide.
Investigators assessed the scene, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. But the position of her body didn't look right. They suspected the victim had been moved.
Pam's right elbow was bent in an upwards direction, like this, with two blood stains on the bottom of her forearm coming up to a point on both sides. I questioned those stains as soon as I saw them because, as we all know, blood can't run uphill. It's against gravity.
The angle of the gun in the dead woman's hand also aroused the investigators' suspicions. It looked as though it was placed in her hand after the fact.
The gun was positioned, and this is unloaded, by the way. The gun was positioned in her hand, bent in this position, close to her head, where it would have been almost impossible to pull the trigger except with a thumb. The gun was clutched very loosely, indicating to me that the arm had been, which had originally been lying on the bed, had been bent at the elbow and raised into that position, and then the weapon had been placed into her hand to make it appear to be a suicide.
Beginning to doubt that this was truly a suicide, detectives looked for other signs of foul play. They found blood smeared on the bathroom light switch. The victim, who died instantly, couldn't have left it. And by his own admission, Aaron Mintz was the only other person in the house. But even that discovery paled in comparison to what detectives discovered next. In another bedroom, they found a pillow with a bullet hole in it. On one side were powder burns. The other side was flecked with blood. Detective Dillman was convinced that the victim was murdered and the pillow used to muffle the shot.
But once I followed this blood trail into the front of the house and found the pillow that was hidden, it didn't take a brain surgeon to, I mean, a big light just blew off. You know, John, this isn't a suicide, you have a murder on your hands.
Police launched a full-scale homicide investigation. The case seemed open and shut. The immediate suspect was the victim's husband, Aaron. There had been no one else in the house. The alarm had not been tripped. Aaron Mintz was a prominent member of the community. He denied murdering his wife. Anxious to clear his name, Mintz agreed that same day to have his hands tested for traces of gunpowder and gunmetal. If he'd fired the gun, the residue would cling to his skin. But Aaron admitted he had washed his hands before the test was conducted. The results were negative. The test failed to prove Aaron killed his wife, but neither did it prove him innocent. Investigators turned their attention to the evidence collected at the house. They focused on the bloodied pillow found in the other bedroom and the switchblade from the bathroom. In 1984, when the crime occurred, DNA testing was not yet available. But the blood type matched the victim's. Blood smears on the front and sleeve of Aaron's bathrobe also matched. Police theorized that blood got on the robe when Aaron rearranged the body. His sleeve probably touched the light switch when he went to wash his hands.
All right, so you went downstairs. You relaxed, watched a little TV, and then fell asleep?
Yes.
And what happened then?
It didn't take much digging for police to determine a possible motive. They learned that Mintz was having an affair with a young woman named Lois Porsche. Pam Mintz found out about her husband's infidelity 2 weeks before her death. She angrily confronted Aaron. She wouldn't let him go without a fight.
She didn't want him embarrassing her in public. And when Aaron began showing up in the circles of their friends with the girl that he was having the affair with, she became irate. She was going to take him for everything he was worth. And he knew it.
Investigators suspected that Aaron killed Pam so he could be free of the marriage without losing his fortune. According to their scenario, Aaron had gone to his wife's bedroom after she'd fallen asleep. He shot her in the head, using the pillow to muffle the sound so as not to alert the neighbors. That would have bought him plenty of time to rearrange the scene, making murder look like suicide. Mintz was charged with murder. To handle his defense, he hired prominent New Orleans attorney Michael Fowler. Like most of those who knew the accused, Fowler was surprised by his arrest.
I would found it most unlikely, that he would have been a subject of a homicide investigation. But by the same token, I didn't know that he was having an affair.
The case was sensationalized in the local press, which gave major coverage to the blood-stained pillow. In the court of public opinion, Aaron's guilt was a foregone conclusion. But in a court of law, the prosecution faced a serious challenge.
You realized that you had an ability to win this case, but you had to do it in terms of the forensics. You had to be able to negate a bunch of different things.
To clear Aaron Mintz, the defense relied on forensics to dismantle the prosecution's case, one piece at a time. A blood-stained bathrobe, a smeared light switch, and a bullet-pierced pillow. This was the evidence presented in the death of Pam Mintz.
I went upstairs and I found Palmer. We've been over this before.
I know that.
To the prosecution, it pointed to Aaron Mintz as a murderer.
I saw my wife dead on the bed.
But the defense saw things differently. They began with Aaron's bathrobe, smeared with his wife's blood. Aaron claimed he'd been dozing in front of the TV downstairs in the early morning. Startled awake by a loud noise, he went to investigate. When he found his wife's body and the gun in her hand, his first reaction was to take her in his arms, hugging her. According to defense attorney Michael Fowler, this scenario also explains the blood on the light switch.
After Aaron had embraced his wife, he turned the light on as he was exiting the room, made every reason why there would be blood there. There was blood on the light switch in the bathroom. That made sense because at a point he went into the bathroom and washed his hands.
The scenario explained away all but the most dramatic piece of evidence, the gunshot pillow. The prosecution argued that Aaron Mintz used the pillow to silence his gun, then removed it from Pam's bedside to conceal his crime. Again, the defense countered. Innocent of any crime, in a state of shock on discovering his wife's body, Aaron removed the pillow almost in a daze. He merely wanted to get it out of his sight without thinking how it might appear to police.
It's only significant if it's a pillow that was used in a homicide. If it's not a pillow that's used in a homicide, it's like a dirty sock. What difference does it make? You know, he just removes it. I mean, we all do crazy things when we're under a great deal of stress.
The defense argued that since Aaron put the pillow where anyone could have found it, his purpose was not concealment.
If he wanted to hide it, he could have hid it. There was a house that sort of was full of nooks and crannies and attic space and all, and he just put it in this other room.
The defense was determined to discount the pillow completely. They stuck with the idea that Pam Mintz killed herself, but they asserted that the fatal bullet wasn't fired through the pillow. The defense had the pillow examined by Irving Stone of the Southwestern Institute for Forensic Sciences in Dallas. He set out to ascertain whether the fatal bullet was in fact fired through the pillow, as police had assumed. Using a weapon of the same caliber as the gun that killed Pam Mintz, Stone conducted tests to simulate what would happen if a gun were fired through a pillow into a human head. As a target, he used a sponge soaked in simulated blood within a heavy plastic bag. Stone shot the bag through the pillow from various distances. He demonstrated that if a pillow had been used to muffle the fatal shot, a great deal more of the victim's blood would have ended up on the pillowcase.
What would have happened as the bullet passed through the pillow into the head, with the pillow being 6 to 10 inches from the head, then there would have been backspatter of blood that would have spattered back on the reverse side of the pillow. Well, there was none of this there.
The blood on the pillow at the crime scene was hardly noticeable. By contrast, in the laboratory, blood was spattered and stained over a wide area. Stone also showed that a bullet fired through a pillow would have left fragments of the pillow behind.
You expect to find cloth, fibers, some other type of polymeric fill material at or around the wound, and actually into the wound itself. I've seen where cloth fragments have been caught by the bullet and just carried right into the wound.
There were no reports of pillow fragments on the bed where the victim was found. Likewise, the coroner found no traces of the pillow in the wound. For Stone, there was only one conclusion. The fatal bullet was not fired through the pillow. But a nagging question remained. What was the pillow doing there in the first place?
On the one hand, we had no obligation to explain the pillow. Once we were able to explain it was not used in a murder, in a homicide. On the other hand, it was there, and we had to deal with it.
The prosecution had portrayed the victim as a wronged woman, murdered so her husband could pursue his affair. But the defense painted an entirely different picture. They portrayed Pam Mintz as a vindictive woman with a long history of emotional distress. Her husband's betrayal had been too much to bear, the defense asserted. She plotted the ultimate revenge. She would kill herself, but in the process, she'd frame her husband for murder. The gunshot pillow would play a starring role. The Mintz's housekeeper testified that she'd seen the victim leaving the house the day before she died, carrying what appeared to be a pillow along with the dry cleaning. Earlier in the day, she'd seen a gun lying on Mrs. Mintz's bed. The defense suggested to the jury that Pam, out for revenge, fired a bullet through the pillow herself. Then she left it at her bedside as she prepared to end her life, knowing that it would appear that her husband had killed her. But there was no way to prove the victim had fired a pistol the day of her death. The police had made no attempt to test her hands for traces of gunpowder. Fowler believes this was a critical mistake.
Despite the fact that she was then undergoing an autopsy, or was about to undergo an autopsy, and her hands had been bagged, the police lab never swabbed her hands, so nobody ever knew, and to this day they never know if there was any residue on her hands. They had every opportunity to do it, they just didn't do it.
If a test had shown that Pam did not fire the gun, the police would have had clear evidence the case was not a suicide. If the test had shown Pam did fire the gun, it would have cleared Aaron of guilt. But Dillman thinks the test results might have been misleading.
I did not order testing on a trace metal test on Pam Mintz's hand due to the fact that it really was irrelevant. We knew that the gun had been placed in her hands, metal had touched her hands, so any type of a trace metal test would have proved positive. That didn't prove anything.
When the case went to trial, the prosecution was confident of the evidence it presented. But the jury found otherwise, accepting the defendant's version of what happened the night Pam Mintz died. The defense claimed she'd put a bullet hole in a pillow and placed it at her bedside as she prepared to end her life. In this way, she hoped to exact retribution on her husband from beyond the grave. But careful forensic analysis of the evidence had foiled her plot. Aaron Mintz was found not guilty in the death of his wife. If hiding the body is not an option, then hiding the crime is the next best choice. But a seamless veil of deception is difficult to weave. At a crime scene, investigators are always looking to challenge their own assumptions. A battery of forensic tests gives them the means to do it. Whether an alibi is grandiose or utterly simple, if it's based on a lie, it won't withstand close scrutiny. Time and again, killers who believe otherwise are proven dead wrong. In Los Angeles, a serial killer eludes police for months. The nightstalker strikes at random, kills at will. The terror he inspires is enormous. The clues he leaves are slight. But ultimately, they're all detectives have to track him down. Investigators at the scene of a strangling rely on an experimental technique to raise invisible clues. They have only one chance to get it right. If they fail, a killer will walk. Crime scenes can be misleading. They can hold plenty of secrets or next to nothing. Harvesting hidden clues is the first strike against the criminal. To catch him, detectives need to turn fleeting prints into lasting impressions. Despite their working familiarity with death, Los Angeles homicide investigators were chilled by the scene they encountered in the affluent community of Whittier on March 29, 1985. The ransacked condition of the house spoke of robbery as the primary motive. A VCR, video camera, and much of the couple's jewelry was taken. But the perpetrator also had a taste for blood. Vincent Zazzara had been killed by a .22 caliber bullet. His wife Maxine was shot in the head and mutilated. The forensics team went to work, but wouldn't find many clues. Though the killer had plundered the home with reckless abandon, he had taken care to protect his identity. Technicians dusting for fingerprints determined that the intruder had worn gloves. whoever had committed these murders left few traces behind. The bullet slugs were too damaged to be of use. After hours of scouring the home for clues, detectives came up empty-handed. The killer, it appeared, had gotten away clean. But he hadn't covered all his tracks. Beneath an open window, detectives located his point of entry. Distinct footprints marked the soil. One of the two prints belonged to the homeowner, Vincent Zazzara. The other appeared to be the footwork of his killer. Technicians sprayed the print with a fixative, then poured plaster into the indentation. The shoe print was lifted from the ground and sent for analysis. At the sheriff's crime lab, criminalist Gerald Burke examined it.
I was asked to check pattern details, size, take measurements of the casts of the impressions, and to see what kind of information I could get from those shoe impressions with regard to manufacturer, make of the shoe, size of the shoe, things of that nature.
The more Burke could learn about the shoes, the better idea detectives would have about the man who filled them. Burke knew the cast was from an extremely large sneaker, but he couldn't determine what brand of shoe it was. In his years of experience, Burke had never come across a print like this. It wasn't in their reference library of tread patterns. He couldn't find it in shoe stores. It had to be a newly released model or an off-market brand. Either way, the print, like the spent bullets, led detectives to a dead end.
No, we didn't. Well, I don't know. They're still pretty young.
Without a source of comparison, Burke's analysis couldn't move the investigation forward. The Zazzara murders weren't the only case that had the sheriff's office puzzled. At the same time, detectives were trying to make sense of a homicide that had occurred less than 2 weeks before, 5 miles away in Rosemead in LA County. Maria Hernandez arrived home late one night and came face to face with the barrel of a .22. Inside the condominium, her roommate, Dale Okazaki, heard the gunshot. She died almost instantly.
Can you tell me what happened?
Maria Hernandez had been lucky.
Come home.
The keys in her hand deflected the bullet. She played dead until the attacker left.
And the gun was right in my face. Just
She told investigators that the killer was a thin Hispanic man in his 20s, dressed all in black.
And I laid there. I just knew that I just needed to lay there.
He had black, bulging eyes, hollow cheeks, and rotting teeth.
Enough light to see.
Hernandez had no idea why he wanted her and her roommate dead.
How tall? Is he as tall as I am? Tall?
For a week, the case went nowhere. And then, in an equally random way, the Zazzaras were killed. The .22 caliber slugs from both crimes were sent to the ballistics lab for comparison. They were too distorted to positively link them to the same gun. Even so, Detective Gil Carrillo of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office drew a connection between the homicides.
We had Maria Hernandez, who's surviving victim in the Hernandez case. You have her giving us a physical description and a drawing of an individual that assaulted her. We have a particular caliber gun. In the Zazzara case, we have no physical description, but we have a shoe print. And we have the same caliber gun.
Not only did he see the two crimes as being connected, Carrillo believed they were part of a much bigger pattern. For weeks, violence had been on the rise in Los Angeles County, a 4,000 square mile area of 88 cities. Night after night throughout the county, the toll of murders, sexual assaults, and abductions grew. The media was in a frenzy, reporting crime after crime. And with each episode, the public's fear swelled. The crime lab worked overtime to process the evidence gathered at the scenes. They weren't coming up with much. Carrillo looked for a common thread in the spree of violence. Based on crime reports and conversations with witnesses, he forged a radical theory. His colleagues saw the crimes as LA's growing trend of violence. While they assumed that the crimes had several perpetrators, Carrillo believed they were all the work of a single man. But Carrillo was new to the homicide department. None of his colleagues bought his theory. Apart from the grotesque violence of the crimes, there was no common denominator to suggest they were committed by one man. The rookie's instinct defied conventional wisdom. The sheriff's department wouldn't entertain the idea of a serial killer until Carrillo could base his suspicion on fact.
And until you had enough physical evidence or conclusive evidence, it's difficult to sell everybody that one man was committing all the crimes that had been committed up until that time.
Before he could prove his theory, Carrillo needed a more definitive pattern to emerge. He wouldn't have to wait long. In the weeks following the Zazzara murders, 7 victims throughout Los Angeles County were wakened in their beds. Women were bound with handcuffs, thumb cuffs, or electrical cords before being sexually assaulted. Houses were turned upside down, valuables stolen. Suburban bedrooms were now the most dangerous place in Los Angeles, and everyone was sleeping lightly. In early June, just 3 blocks from the Zazzara's house, a deputy's wife was roused from her sleep. She thought she heard a window opening. Someone was in the house. Hearing the couple's movement, the prowler slipped away. The deputy called the sheriff's department. In the daylight, investigators found gouge marks where the prowler broke in. The deputy pointed investigators to the flower bed, where he'd covered some evidence with a shoebox. Beneath it was the imprint of a large athletic shoe. The waffle pattern was familiar. It looked just like the tread found outside the Zazzara's house. It was the break detectives had been waiting for. If this print matched the print found at the Zazzara murders, it would support Carrillo's theory that one man was stalking LA's neighborhoods. But if that were true, it meant that one lone killer had managed for 1 year to defy LA's best and brightest. Now that he had a basis for comparison, criminalist Gerald Burke examined the 2 plaster casts taken from the crime scenes. He determined the prints were made by shoes of the same model, but not necessarily by the exact same shoe. Because both prints were left in coarse dirt, Burke was unable to identify the subtle marks that make each shoe unique.
Things like little nicks and cuts and scratches, or something that can be used as an identification, more or less like a fingerprint in one shoe sole to another.
This was of little help to detectives. In a county of 7.5 million people, they could not track a man solely by his tread marks. But it was all they had to go on. And it kept showing up again and again. Since the Zazzara murders, the large waffle pattern was found in the mud outside a Monterey Park homicide and was stamped in blood inside the home of a severely beaten old woman in Monrovia. Burke had 3 casts and 1 shoe print to work with. The crimes remained unsolved. The shoe prints remained a mystery. Then, a summer intern casually walking by a lab table made a pivotal observation.
She said, "Oh, that's an Avia." And everybody just stopped and looked at her and said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yeah, I got a pair in my trunk." So she goes to the trunk of her car and pulls out this pair of Avia shoes, and that's when everything broke loose.
Avia was a new brand, explaining why the department had no information on them. In order to learn everything they could about this shoe, investigators went to Avia headquarters in Portland, Oregon. The company's designer identified the model number of the shoe that made the print. Burke pressed for more information.
I asked him to be a little bit more specific, and he said that he actually designed that shoe, and that he had a patent on that particular shoe sole design, and that there were no other patterns that were close.
The pattern was from an aerobic shoe that had only been on the market for 4 months. Only 1,300 pairs had been manufactured. Avia provided Burke with a number of soles from the factory so that he could accurately determine the size of the shoe that left the print. The rate of motion and the texture of the ground can greatly distort the impression. The only way to size the shoe was to compare tread patterns. The pattern details on the sole increase as the shoe size increases.
Down here in the bottom of the shoe, actually the mid portion of the shoe, you'll see that there are a number of chevrons. And these chevrons actually increase in number with the increasing shoe size. And the plaster casts, although they weren't good enough quality to record the Avia logo, they were good enough quality to allow me to count these pattern elements, these pattern details.
After counting the lines on the plaster casts, Burke was able to identify every cast he had as coming from a size 11.5 shoe. When he examined the marketing material from the manufacturer, he realized what a crucial discovery he'd made. Of the 1,300 pairs of this model manufactured, only 6 had been shipped to Los Angeles. Of those 6, only 1 was an 11.5. Only a handful of men in the country owned size 11.5 Avias. Carrillo's improbable theory of a single killer was now glaringly real.
When you start throwing the odds of more than one person wearing that particular model and size of shoe, it becomes, it narrows it down quite a bit that not more than one person is committing the crimes. When you have physical descriptions coupled with physical shoe prints, you've got, I mean, that's a neon sign saying, "Come get me." That's one man.
One very dangerous man that required county-wide attention. And getting him wouldn't be easy. They didn't know who he was, but terror had a name. The media dubbed him the Nightstalker. The Sheriff's Department organized a task force of homicide detectives. Carrillo teamed up with Frank Salerno. From his experience hunting some of LA's most deadly serial killers, Salerno knew what kind of challenges they faced.
It's very frustrating. You know, there's one individual out there that's committing all these crimes, and very violent, serious crimes, and you want to bring it to an end as quickly as you can.
The task force started small, then swelled as evidence accumulated.
At one point, we had about 75 investigators working in the bureau at that time, and we were using 1/3 of them just to investigate the Nightstalker series.
The Nightstalker held Los Angeles in a reign of terror during the summer of 1985. Night after night, people were struck down in the place they used to feel safest, their own homes. Pressure to solve the case was tremendous. But until detectives like Gil Carrillo uncovered the Nightstalker's identity, they couldn't calm the panic.
Gun sales went up, burglar alarm systems went up. Everybody was locking their windows and doors during a very, very warm summer. And you're talking about something that just took over the entire county of Los Angeles.
Law enforcement took to the streets. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods where the Nightstalker had struck, hoping that someone recognized him. They found nothing but petrified residents, and they knew better than to go at night. After dark, people weren't opening their doors to anyone. Sergeant John Yarborough was responsible for collecting evidence connected to the crimes.
In one house, I found a couple who had abandoned sleeping in their bed. They'd created dummies in the bed. The husband was sleeping routinely in the garage, and the wife was sleeping behind a television with the portable telephone. I mean, that was the kind of fear and panic that developed over this case.
Whether he killed his victims or let them live seemed as random as the rest of his behavior. Those who survived his attacks described, as Maria Hernandez had, a tall man with bulging eyes. He was saturated in a rank, leathery odor.
How about the mouth?
With the help of an identikit, a staff artist created a likeness of the man who had attacked them.
Did he have mustache, any facial hair?
So good to you? Yeah, looks good. I think that's him. I think that's it.
Detectives knew what he looked like, but he thwarted every effort to find him. The Nightstalker's unpredictability made his next move impossible to anticipate. Most serial killers conform to a regimented routine. This one seemed to work at random. He hit neighborhoods all over Los Angeles. His victims, both men and women, varied in age, ethnicity, and economic background. His MO was all over the map.
What we had was a man that sometimes used a gun, sometimes used a knife, sometimes used blunt force trauma, some he raped, some he didn't, some he strangled, some he just stomped to death, some he robbed, some he didn't.
The only thing he never changed was his shoes. To track the Nightstalker, Gerald Burke had to become an expert in the killer's footwear. He was dispatched to any crime scene that seemed remotely linked to him.
Okay, that sounds good. I was out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning on one side of the county, and at 6 o'clock in the morning I would be called to another side of the county, and I was just all over the place.
And though detectives could track the killer by his shoe prints, they always lagged one step behind him. On July 5th, they followed his tracks to the posh community of Sierra Madre.
Dad!
That morning, 16-year-old Whitney Bennett woke up backwards in bed. She had a searing headache. While the Bennett family slept just feet away, the girl had been beaten near death with a tire iron. She remembered nothing about the attack, but the familiar calling card was there. Sergeant John Yarborough speculated that the killer had 2 reasons for wearing the same shoes over and over again. First, They were functional. They allowed him to move surreptitiously or run if he needed to. Secondly, they'd never let him down.
But psychologically, it may have been the good luck shoes. He always wore them. They were always successful. He was always able to do what he wanted to do when he was wearing these shoes, so they had a good feeling for him.
The brutality of the crimes advertised the killer's lack of remorse and his delight in causing death.
I would say that he's a very good example of the predator-type offender who clearly just does not care about the victims that he comes in contact with. And he achieves a degree of thrill from it. That motivates him. Now, is he intelligent and cunning and clever? Well, he was certainly clever enough.
The Night Stalker was crazy like a fox and just as hard to corner. The task force wasn't enough. If detectives were going to capture this serial killer, they needed to spread out. Investigators made a videotape for LA County's 63 police departments. On the tape, Carrillo detailed the evidence gathered from the crime scenes. The suspect was a young Hispanic male who always wore Avias. An expert cat burglar, it was impossible to tell if his primary motive was killing or robbery. As the body count grew, a few patterns emerged. He seemed to target yellow or beige houses. He sometimes drew pentagrams at the crime scene. But this information brought detectives no closer to identifying the horrible face that haunted Southern California. The violence reached a frenzy as the summer of 1985 wore on. By early August, the Night Stalker was suspected of killing 13 people and attacking 10 others. His activity in and around Los Angeles seemed to be accelerating. Law enforcement braced for his next assault. And then, nothing. For the first time in months, nights were passing peacefully. But not for long. On August 18th, the Night Stalker struck again, this time in San Francisco. Peter and Barbara Pan, a couple who lived in a yellow house, were found murdered. It was the typical pattern: forced entry in the middle of the night, brutal murders, pentagrams, and stolen valuables. The unpredictable Night Stalker had just expanded his territory by 380 miles. The entire state was now under his grip. Where he'd strike next, no one could predict. San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein called a press conference to calm the citywide hysteria. But she divulged sensitive forensic information detailing the sneakers and the ballistics findings. Detectives believed the Night Stalker was following his case in the media. All along, he had enjoyed toying with law enforcement. Now that he knew exactly what they had on him, the advantage was his. He was likely to change his MO, and he was sure to discard his signature footwear. But a few good things came out of the media hype. San Francisco newspapers publicized the items of jewelry stolen from the Pans. A $10,000 bounty was placed on the Night Stalker's head. Informants started coming out of the woodwork. An informant, Donna Myers, told police that a man named Rick from El Paso had given her a bracelet and some rings.
He was very tall.
Like the description of the Night Stalker, Rick had terrible teeth, smelled bad, and was always spouting off about the virtues of Satan.
About my length, very full.
Police learned his last name was Ramirez.
Very dark brown to black.
Police now knew who he was, but they still had to find him. The Los Angeles phone book was full of men named Richard Ramirez. A fingerprint lifted from a stolen car at a crime scene pointed the finger of blame at a single suspect.
When Ramirez's name came up, they pulled all the Ramirez's that had been arrested, which there were numerous of them, Richard Ramirez's, and they physically checked it just like you would by eye and made that identification.
Once they determined which Ramirez they were after, surveillance personnel were deployed all over Los Angeles. They concentrated on places Ramirez was known to frequent. One of those places was the bus depot. Uniformed officers and undercover cops swarmed the station. But since they were looking for a man attempting to leave LA, they didn't pay attention to arriving passengers. Ramirez, returning from Tucson, spotted the undercover officers before they saw him. He slipped out of the bus terminal and went to an East LA bodega for some breakfast. He quickly realized that he was the center of attention. El Matador, they whispered, the killer. Police were called. The chase was on. Ramirez ran for his life along the 5 freeway.
He ran like a gazelle. He literally ran at a full sprint, probably a good 2-3 miles. Kept going, went over 10-foot sound walls, crossed 8 lanes of the 5 freeway right here.
The fugitive made his way into a residential neighborhood of East LA. He saw his only way out, but it wouldn't take him far. Police interceded. The man they protected from attack was the man they'd been hunting for months. Their prime suspect, Richard Ramirez. At the police station, all eyes moved toward his shoes. They weren't Avia's. The nightstalker was too clever to wear those again, but they were size 11.5. It seemed they had their man, but they didn't have his shoes. As always, it appeared the nightstalker remained one step ahead of them.
Pinky, let's see your pinky.
Both Carrillo and his partner Frank Salerno believed that Richard Ramirez was the nightstalker, but they didn't have the notorious sneakers. To build their case, the detectives would need to carefully draw together the web of evidence. Their first task was to interview the suspect. His demeanor surprised them.
Very soft-spoken. For lack of a lot of education, he was well-spoken also. Probably the thing that sticks in my mind the most is when you walk into an interview room with a suspected killer, is you usually introduce yourself, you tell them who you are. And I walked in and sat down, he says, "You're Frank Salerno."
Ramirez knew of him from the Hillside Strangler case, involving a pair of high-profile serial killers Salerno helped nab 6 years earlier. Detectives learned that their suspect had a vast working knowledge of serial killers throughout history. He knew all of their names, their methods, and the details of their captures. He had followed the nightstalker case in the media. Though he never admitted to any crimes, Ramirez engaged detectives in a conversation about LA's latest serial killer.
He would talk to us in the third person. I didn't do this, but the nightstalker might have done this. And the nightstalker might have done this and this, and what do you think he'd have done over here?
Ramirez never confessed, so investigators looked for hard evidence to tie Ramirez to the crime spree. Inside his wallet, they had found a claim ticket for a piece of luggage at the bus station. Everything was removed and photographed. The bag contained a revolver and several kinds of ammunition, including .22 caliber cartridges. The evidence was bagged for further analysis. The shells and slugs collected from various crime scenes were taken to the ballistics lab to compare against those taken from the bag. They matched. Also, Ramirez's fingerprints were found on some of the items, confirming that the bag and its contents belonged to him. Most of the Night Stalker's surviving victims picked him out of a lineup. The eyewitness accounts, ballistics, fingerprint, and shoe print evidence provided police with enough to arrest Ramirez for the Night Stalker crimes. 3 years after the arrest, the case finally went to trial. By this time, police suspected that he had killed 16 people and assaulted 11 others. The suspect made no show of repentance. During a preliminary hearing, he sported a pentagram on the palm of his hand. He waved it about, shouting, "Hail Satan." Though no size 11.5 Avia aerobic sneakers were recovered among Ramirez's belongings, it was the prints found in 8 of the crime scenes that held the case together. They formed an irrefutable physical link between the string of burglaries, rapes, and murders. Eyewitness testimony tied the man in court to other crimes, even when no print was present. The most expensive trial Los Angeles had yet seen came to a close after more than a year with a victory for the prosecution. In November 1989, Ramirez was sentenced to death 19 times. Richard Ramirez was one of the most horrifying monsters to terrorize the country. But whether a killer takes many lives or only one, the motivation to kill remains the same. Murder is the ultimate selfish act. On September 2nd, 1990, in Des Moines, Iowa, William Helm and his brother stopped by the home of his estranged wife to pick up some tools. The house was locked. There was no sign of his wife. He could see their son playing unsupervised. He became alarmed.
Susan? Susan? Susan?
Then he found her in the bedroom. Helm called the police. Officers arrived to find a woman's nude body lying in bed. A blanket was pulled up to her chin. Susan Helm, a 24-year-old housewife, was last seen alive at 2 a.m. when neighbors picked up a child she'd been babysitting. The same clothes she'd been wearing the previous night were crumpled on the bedroom floor.
What time did you guys get here?
Police asked William Helm about his relationship with his wife. He told them they were separated and he had moved out. He said he had last seen her the day before when he dropped off their son. They learned through interviews with the couple's friends that there had been a history of domestic violence. A police report stated that William had assaulted Susan 9 months earlier. Nothing in the house seemed out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of burglary. Captain James Trotter of the Des Moines Police Department led the investigation.
We have a routine that we go through on all crime scenes, particularly indoor crime scenes, and we start from the outside and work towards the center to preserve as much of the evidence and photograph it as we possibly can.
The forensics team methodically combed the house in search of the smallest clue as to what took place. Though the victim was nude, they found no evidence of sexual assault. Technicians couldn't find hair, fingerprints, or blood samples to link the killer to his crime. The ligature mark around her neck told of a brutal death by strangulation. Detectives formed some theories. Because of the way in which the body had been covered, they believed that the victim had been killed by someone she knew. Someone who cared enough to conceal her nudity from strangers.
Usually what happens is that after the crime has been committed, then they think, oh my God, somebody's going to see my wife or girlfriend or cousin or whatever the circumstance is, and they'll cover them up. So it's a good clue. Simply that, it's just a clue to lead us in a direction in our investigation.
As the bedding was examined, they uncovered another clue. Beneath the blanket, the body had been placed on top of a sheet, and on that sheet was an oily mark that looked like a shoe print.
I think you might have some imprints on the carpet. That's why I want you to be
The
careful
print
with
wasn't
that.
distinct enough to be
Use
used for
vodka for the time
comparison,
being.
but it suggested that the body had been moved.
Walk up alongside of the bed if you could. Pull that sheet back just a tad.
And so we concluded from that more than likely someone stood on the bed and maybe pulled or lifted the body onto the bed.
Samples of the blood. Okay.
The oily shoe print was made by automotive grease, embedded with small metal fragments. William Helm welded mufflers for a living. Though the print made him the prime suspect, it would be difficult to build a case against him. The physical evidence, it seemed, would only prove something he'd already admitted, that he'd entered the home, gone into the bedroom, and found the body.
I was going to pick up my daughter, so I pulled up.
Helm was brought to the police station to make an official statement. Investigators tried to pin him down about any physical contact he may have had with the victim's body when he found her.
I knocked on the door and then there was no
Helm
answer.
claimed that he hadn't moved the bedding at all. He'd only used his fingertips to check her pulse at the wrist and neck.
And so it was critical that we have some physical evidence, otherwise we were only going to have a circumstantial case and probably not anything that we could arrest anybody for.
Detectives hoped that the body would disclose the secrets that the rest of the house had been hiding. More than a shooting or stabbing, strangulation requires close contact with the victim. Surely the killer left something behind. Detectives used an alternative light source to search for hair or fibers. Again, they found nothing. Unless a substantial clue surfaced soon, there would be no way to catch this killer. As investigators finished their search of the crime scene, they realized that they were being watched. After leaving the police station, Helm had returned to the scene of the crime. He pulled a lawn chair out of his car and set up an observation post on the neighbor's lawn. Peculiar behavior for someone who just lost his spouse.
That type of interest is usually to spectators who don't know these people, and normally the family is somewhere else consoling one another.
You never touched your wife. You went directly.
Helms' detached interest in the case fueled detective suspicions.
Never touched your wife. No.
They asked him to come to the station for another interview.
But you want to know why?
After almost 2 hours of questioning, police obtained enough information to get a warrant to collect samples of his hair, saliva, blood, and handprints.
Okay, pull it up.
In order to prove that Helm had killed his wife, police would have to find evidence that he was the one who moved the body. If Trotter's team could find Helm's fingerprints on a portion of the victim's skin that had been beneath the blanket, they'd be able to test his story. But they faced a big obstacle. In the field, no one had ever successfully lifted finger or palm prints from a body before. Des Moines police had tried and failed 6 times before. At a crime scene, it is difficult to control the variables required for success. Proper timing, temperature, and humidity were crucial. The experimental technique to raise fingerprints from skin had only succeeded in laboratories. If they could make it work at a real crime scene, it would bring criminal investigation to a whole new level of precision. The technique relies upon superglue's ability to turn the human touch into a permanent imprint. Years ago, workers at a superglue factory noticed that if they weren't careful, they left their fingerprints on the glue packaging. And because of their exposure to the glue fumes, these fingerprints couldn't be wiped off. Vaporized superglue, or cyanoacrylate ester, adheres to the oil deposited by the human touch. It attaches to fingerprints on hard substances such as glass or metal, creating a thin shell over the ridged pattern. It actually seals the print under a layer of plastic. In most cases, this pattern can then be dusted and lifted with tape. But lifting a delicate print off a textured, oily surface like skin is a tricky procedure. If there were any prints on Susan Helm's body, they wouldn't survive a trip to the coroner's office. The slightest change in temperature or the lightest brush against the body could ruin them. The testing would have to be done where the body lay. In the lab, the technique had succeeded only on prints less than 4 hours old. Susan Helm had been dead for more than 12 hours. But it was the only hope police had of tying the murderer to the crime. The first step was to build a tent around the victim. A plastic drop cloth was wrapped around the frame and secured. Temperature within the tent must be increased to speed the evaporation of the glue. In the field, it's difficult to control. Liquid superglue was placed in aluminum dishes and set on burners inside the tent. The glue was heated for 10 minutes until fumes filled the structure. Technicians allowed 30 minutes for the glue to set. After the fumes settled, technicians moved in. Whatever lay beneath the plastic would make or break the case. If they could find a good quality print, they might be able to catch a killer. But if history were any guide, they'd find only a degraded print or none at all. And that meant a killer would walk. The plastic was peeled back from the body. Technicians searched for the ridges of a human fingerprint with a halogen flashlight. Shining the light at an angle helps the prints stand out. Passing over the lower portion of the victim's abdomen, the light revealed a pattern. It wasn't a fingerprint. It was larger and more distinct than they could have imagined. The print from practically an entire hand. The potential proof was there for the investigators to see. But success still seemed just beyond their grasp. For the first time in forensic history, scientists had been able to coax a latent print from a human body outside of the laboratory. But collecting the print would be another matter. Lifting it with tape would likely destroy it. Scientists needed to lift the print photographically. The photographed print from the victim's belly was delivered to the Des Moines Police Department crime lab, where it was compared to the print taken from William Helm. When comparing two fingerprints, identification technicians use a computer to look for matching patterns. Because palm prints are so intricate, technician Jerry Wilson had to make the comparison manually. The time-consuming task requires him to pinpoint areas where ridges join, diverge, or form dots.
The ridge on the outside.
Using those patterns as reference points, Wilson compares the prints for similarities.
And we look for these same identical points in the same relative unit space in each between the latent and the ink print, and the same amount of intervening ridges. And we also look for discrepancies, because if there's unexplained discrepancies, then you have to either eliminate the print altogether or explain why there is a discrepancy.
Technicians found no such discrepancies between the prints. Instead, they identified a highly unusual formation on both.
There was a double loop formation in the palm print, which is very unusual. And that helped to locate the pattern area and made the comparison much easier between the inked and the latent print.
Right here we've got an upward ending ridge.
Wilson can call two prints a match if they share 8 common reference points.
Right there.
In the Helm case, technicians stopped counting at 90.
Up in the interdigital area, so we got 2 delta
It was one of the most
formations.
obvious matches their office had ever come across.
There.
The discovery of William Helm's palm print on his dead wife's belly proved he was lying. He was the one who placed her into bed. It seemed police had caught the killer with a drop of glue. But to make a conviction stick, they needed to connect him directly to the murderous act. The victim wasn't strangled with bare hands. The killer had used a length of wire. Police had enough evidence to obtain a search warrant for Helm's apartment. There, they found the final piece of the puzzle. The garrote, a piano wire stretched between 2 wooden handles, has only one purpose: strangulation. Though tests in the lab showed no trace evidence on the wire, its gauge was consistent with the marks on the victim's neck. Trotter pieced together a likely scenario of the murder. On the morning she was killed, Susan and William Helm had argued for the last time. William became enraged and took her life. He tried to cover his deed with a blanket, but the persistence and methodical attention to detail of the Des Moines Police Department produced the clue that marked him as a killer. William Helm was convicted of first-degree murder in the strangling death of his wife. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
The forensic evidence in this case was extremely important because of the lack of witnesses and blood and all those other kinds of things that you can typically use to prove your case. So the fingerprint, or the palm print in this case, was the turning point for us.
By making sense of obscure prints, forensic scientists helped expose the crimes of Richard Ramirez and William Helm. Thanks to advances in technology, murderers like them can no longer escape the lasting impressions they leave behind. A National Guardsman is shot while he sleeps. Investigators believe it's an accident at first. A newlywed almost becomes a widow as her husband lingers near death. As doctors race to save him, detectives suspect someone was trying to kill him with kindness. Investigating a businessman's murder on a country road, detectives find themselves enmeshed in a tangle of lies and few real clues. In search of answers, they hit the library. Sometimes the least likely suspects are the most likely candidates for committing murder. The so-called fairer sex has been unfairly overlooked when accusations fly. But old stereotypes are being shattered by women who kill. Right now in the United States, more than 3,000 criminals sit on death row for murder. Only 42 of them are women. It's easy to assume that women aren't as inclined to lethal violence. But maybe women are simply better at getting away with it, shielded by our wrong assumptions about what constitutes a killer. But once the manicured finger of suspicion points to them, it's up to forensic investigators to prove their guilt. Early on February 1st, 1988, paramedics in the Durham County, North Carolina Sheriff's Office were called to the home of Barbara and Russell Stagger. There had been a terrible accident. Russell Stagger had been shot in the head while he slept. A .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol and a spent shell casing lay next to him on the bed. Through her tears, Barbara Stagger explained what happened. Groggy with sleep, she had accidentally fumbled with a gun used for protecting their home against burglars. She had brushed the trigger. The pistol had fired. Though critically wounded, Russell Stagger was still alive. Doctors did everything they could for Stagger, but within hours, the grim prognosis was clear. Barbara was told her husband of 9 years had no hope of recovery. She signed a consent form to take him off life support. Russell Stagger died that afternoon without regaining consciousness. The whole community mourned his loss. Stagger had been well respected in Durham as the high school baseball team's head coach. Once, when the budget for bats and gloves was cut, he took a stand for the team and donated his own money to make up the shortfall. When Stagger wasn't defending his players, he was defending his country as a staff sergeant in the National Guard. Police were prepared to list his death an accident. But his first wife, Lynn Snow, wasn't so sure. She went to police with her suspicions. She'd remained friends with Russell, who told her that his relationship with Barbara had soured, even to the point that he feared for his safety. She urged police not to dismiss the case so quickly. According to Snow, Russell said that Barbara Stagger had a ruinous appetite for cash, clothes, and jewelry. And Russell was never sure where she was getting all her money. To check on the first wife's story, investigators questioned other friends of the victim.
He received the best training.
They learned from his fellow National Guardsmen that Russell Stagger was a firearms instructor and extremely cautious around guns. To Police Captain Ricky Buchanan, the questions raised were enough to keep the investigation open.
Nobody with that kind of knowledge about weapons would have slept with one under their pillow, particularly not locked, not cocked, and the safety off. Nobody in their right mind does. But that was what would have had to happen if you believe Barbara's story.
Buchanan wasn't sure he believed it anymore. It was time to look at the widow more closely. Investigators found that arrest warrants had been issued on Barbara Stagger for her chronic check bouncing. She had even forged her husband's name on checks and loan applications. But each time, she somehow managed to pay off her debts and dodge a conviction. Then she would borrow and spend even more, leading to ever more devious ways of getting the cash she craved. She'd written a book called Untimely Death about a man who accidentally killed himself. Though it was fiction, it was based on Barbara's experience with her first husband, Larry Ford. He died in a freak shooting accident 1 year before Barbara married Russell Stagger. Through her writing, Barbara had found a way to cash in on the tragedy.
She sent it to the Doubleday publisher, as I recall. They sent her a rejection letter. But then she took the logo off of the rejection letter and taped it onto a sheet of paper and typed out an acceptance letter where she was going to get, I think, maybe $25,000 advance on the book.
Using the forged letter as collateral, Barbara Stagger secured a bank loan. But curious friends called the publisher to get the book's release date and learned it was rejected. When Russell found out, he managed to forgive Barbara. She returned the $25,000 and the bank didn't prosecute. But to detectives, it seemed that a new target lay squarely in the crosshairs of her ambition. $25,000 would be small change compared to Russell Stagger's life insurance. When all his policies were added up, his death would net this two-time widow more than $200,000. Barbara Stagger was known to lie for money. Buchanan suspected she would kill for it. He knew she fired the fatal bullet. Now he had to prove it was no accident. Barbara had told police she didn't know how to shoot a gun, but Russell Stagger's friends disagreed. They said Barbara was an excellent shot. The victim himself had taught her. It appeared that his lessons may have been turned against him. Investigators knew that if they could find more inconsistencies in Barbara's story, they could build their case. They interviewed all the paramedics, police officers, and doctors who had heard Barbara's account of the accident. But no one had gotten the same story from her.
They had
She told paramedics she had reached for the gun when a barking dog made her think a prowler was near the house. She told someone else that her son's alarm had awakened her.
357?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
When the gun had gone off, she'd been putting it away, lest her husband think the boy was a burglar.
And I see him there.
Barbara Stagger was spinning a tangle of lies even she couldn't sort out. But police had a plan to snare her in her own web. To catch a killer, investigators set an ingenious trap. To get Russell Stagger's widow to stick to a story, they asked Barbara Stagger to reenact the accident for them.
Thank you very much.
She was happy to oblige.
Well, Mrs. Stager,
When detectives asked if they could videotape the demonstration,
Sure.
she said yes once again.
That's a big assistance. Thank you very much.
She shot her husband on Monday, and she crawled back in that bed on Friday. And I really don't think a person under normal circumstances would do that if it were an accidental shooting. And she reenacted it for us. And with no emotion, no hesitation.
I don't know how.
This time, Barbara said that while in a sleepy haze, she had pulled out the pistol.
What it was, started to get up, to get it out from under there, heard the noise, shocked, couldn't figure out what it was, sort of realized what had happened, turned over.
She put on her glasses and turned on the light. She cradled her husband's head in her lap, trying to revive him. When paramedics arrived, the victim still lay as if he were asleep, without ever having been moved. It was clear to authorities that Russell Stagger had received no first aid from his wife. In fact, between the time she phoned for help and the arrival of the paramedics, she had gotten dressed, all while her husband lay dying. After her taped performance, the only thing she wanted to know was how the insurance companies would know her husband's death was an accident. She wouldn't see a dime until such a ruling was officially on the books.
Well, thank you. We're not...
Detectives told her a little paperwork still remained. With that, they left. They had what they wanted on videotape.
There will never, ever be another gun.
I didn't give her any indication that she made me a happy man by any means. And when I left there, she was certain that it was going to be declared an accidental death. But I knew once she reenacted that we had her.
Detectives studied the videotape of Barbara Stagger's reenactment with an eye toward finding inconsistencies. She had told them the gun had gone off while she held it low next to the bed. Forensic science told a different story. The bullet pierced the lower right portion of the victim's skull and struck above the left eye. Based on his position, this suggested that the gun was tilted downward. But the way Barbara described the accident, the bullet would have moved in an upward trajectory.
And it indicated to us that she was above and behind Russ at the time she pulled the trigger.
That wasn't the only problem with her pantomime. If the pistol had fired under the bed sheets, as Barbara said, there would have been powder burns on the fabric. None were found. That suggested the gun was fired at a distance from the bed. And yet, the cartridge casing was lying next to the victim. Nothing was adding up, but all of it pointed to Barbara's guilt.
How are you? Fine.
It didn't stop there. Police learned that within hours of reenacting the incident, she and two family members presented the victim's will for probate. Though it was signed by Russell Stagger, it was witnessed only by members of Barbara's immediate family.
Since you are the sole proprietor.
The clerk recalled that Barbara showed little emotion during the
We
process.
estimated about $98,000.
When detectives learned how quickly Barbara had tried to push the document through, they examined it as potential evidence. Investigators compared the signature on the will to the victim's National Guard papers. They found that the will had definitely been forged. It was just one more page in Barbara's trail of worthless paper. The inheritance and the insurance money may have been her motive for killing her husband, or she may have just been eager to cash in on Russell's accident. Police needed a more tangible clue to link her to the intentional murder of her husband. Attention focused on the curious proximity of the shell casing to the victim's body. The gun was taken to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab in Raleigh. Experts here evaluate more than 30,000 pieces of evidence annually for state, local, federal, and military law enforcement agencies. In test firing Stagger's gun, investigators found that the bullet casing ejects at least 3.5 feet from the weapon. There was no logical way it could have landed so close to the victim's head, unless Barbara had moved it after she fired. Police learned that similar questions were raised during the death investigation of her first husband 10 years earlier. According to reports at the time of her first husband's death, police noted that the position of the shell casing was suspicious, but it wasn't documented well enough to make a case for homicide. It looked like Barbara was up to her old tricks. This time, she wasn't going to get away with it. Investigators felt they had developed a strong case against Barbara Stagger, but the most compelling piece of evidence was found miles from the scene. One of Russell Stagger's former students found an audio cassette in the high school gym. When it was played, his brother recognized the voice of his ex-coach, Russell Stagger.
Poor Stagger, he died a little while back.
Sometimes I wonder if I'm just being paranoid about all
Man, what are you doing with that? Wait a minute, wait.
Now, you said you had something?
They took the tape to police. On it, Russell Stagger poured out his apprehensions about his wife, from her compulsive spending to the death of her first husband and his creeping suspicion that he might be next. The tape, coupled with the crime lab bullet evidence, was enough to bring the case to trial. The prosecution carefully laid out the motives and the events leading to Russell Stagger's death. Barbara's financial problems had come to a head. Without a massive infusion of cash, she would face bankruptcy. One morning, when the pressure became too great, Barbara Stagger rose and took careful aim. The forensic evidence was compelling. The actual bullet trajectory did not agree with Barbara Stagger's story. Neither did the spent shell's ejection path. When the district attorney played the haunting tape of Russell Stagger's suspicions, it sealed Barbara's fate.
Oh, it had traumatic impact. Hearing it in court, I mean, this is the first time that I know of that a homicide victim actually had his day in court and testified from the witness stand, because it was just as if Russ himself was there.
Though Barbara Stagger may have dreamed of gold, she was led away in chains of steel. Based on the forensic evidence, she was convicted of the first-degree murder of her husband and sentenced to life in prison. A shooting death leaves obvious clues behind, but killing with kindness can go undetected sometimes for years. In April of 1989, Reverend Dwight Moore and his new wife Blanche were driving home to North Carolina after their honeymoon. It was a second marriage for both of them, and they were happy to be making a fresh start.
It gave us a break.
All was wedded bliss. Until on the Cape May Lewis ferry, Reverend Moore fell gravely ill. Blanche drove her husband home to Winston-Salem, determined to nurse him back to health.
Hello, sweetheart.
She was a fine cook and thought that some of her good food would do the trick.
Oh my gosh.
Despite her care, her new husband's condition grew worse. Finally, he was rushed to the hospital, suffering from severe abdominal cramps. His doctor believed he had come down with an intestinal flu. But the Reverend told him his symptoms began shortly after he'd cleaned his garage of old household chemicals. He believed that something there had made him ill. Or perhaps it was the chemicals he'd recently sprayed on his lawn. Doctors performed a series of tests to determine what he may have been exposed to. The results revealed a shocking level of arsenic. Because arsenic poisoning is uncommon, North Carolina's chief medical examiner, John Butts, was called to investigate where the toxin may have come from. He didn't believe it could have entered Reverend Moore's system from cleaning his garage.
Arsenic is used in some fungicides, insecticides, and so there are possibilities for unintentional or accidental poisonings, but they're quite rare.
Arsenic is a highly toxic metallic element. Everyone has traces of it in their body, but Reverend Moore demonstrated an almost superhuman tolerance to it. He consumed enough to kill 10 men. It would be almost impossible to accidentally ingest that much of the poison.
There are certain medications that do contain arsenic. They're usually mainly in veterinary medicine against certain kinds of parasites, but there are very, very few medications, almost no medications that would be used in this country for humans that would contain arsenic.
His family gathered at his bedside, not sure if the Reverend would survive one of the highest levels of arsenic poisoning on record.
You told me he was fine.
He was. I brought a little sample to my husband.
Slowly, he regained his strength, fortified by some of his new wife's home cooking.
Oh, that's wonderful.
The fact that he'd survived this long suggested that he'd built up a tolerance through many small doses over a period of time. In other words, he may have been systematically poisoned. His ordeal wasn't over yet. Further tests showed that his arsenic levels were increasing while he lay in the hospital. Suspecting foul play, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation cleared Reverend Moore's room and posted a guard at the door.
I'm gonna have to ask everyone to leave the room and go down to the waiting room.
The patient was to eat no more food brought from outside the hospital. Investigators had every indication that he was being poisoned by someone he knew, someone he trusted, perhaps even someone in his own family. Their first suspect was his son, a biochemist. He'd have the know-how to do it, but he didn't have the opportunity to administer the poison.
This is with your new stepmom.
While police worked to protect Reverend Moore, the hospital staff worked to cure him. He was treated with a chelating agent, a compound that bonded with the arsenic in his body to flush it out of his system. The treatment was as painful as the poison. Meantime, investigators interviewed him to determine some clue about who might have been poisoning him. As the conversation turned to his family, Moore described his courtship with Blanche. One detail caught the detective's attention. Blanche's previous boyfriend, Raymond Reed, had died of a disease with all the symptoms of a serious stomach flu, symptoms very similar to what the Reverend was suffering from.
Was there anything
Investigators
else about,
began to delve into
about that
Blanche's
that
past.
any interest or
I don't think
anything
so.
suspicious?
Oh, good morning, Blanche. How are you?
She had met her former boyfriend, Raymond Reed, while working in the grocery store he managed.
Didn't. No.
They had been together for 15 years when Reed was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a debilitating nerve disease that attacks the spinal cord. It begins as numbness and can progress to paralysis and sometimes death. But another frightening aspect of Guillain-Barré is that it's the most common misdiagnosis for long-term arsenic poisoning. To test that theory, investigators requested Reed's complete medical records. While they waited, they collected a sample of Reverend Moore's hair to see how long he'd been poisoned.
More if you take and close that one.
Hair can be a very valuable substance for testing in cases of arsenic poisoning because as the hair grows, any arsenic that's present in the blood at that time will get deposited into the roots of the hair.
How you doing?
Like a modern-day Delilah, Blanche thought that by cutting her husband's hair, she'd weaken the state's case against
You're
her.
gonna be the best-looking guy in the neighborhood.
But when she brought her brother to the hospital to give Reverend Moore a close trim, she was too late. Investigators had already gathered the sample they needed. When Reverend Moore's hair was tested, it was polluted with arsenic from follicle to tip, meaning he'd been fed a steady diet of the toxin. He'd had 2 large doses 7 and 8 months earlier, in November and December 1988. He'd spent time in the hospital, but the poison went undetected. The same couldn't be said for Raymond Reed. When his medical records arrived, investigators made an alarming discovery. He'd been done in by a clerical error. At one point during his hospitalization, his doctors had ordered a test for heavy metals. But the results were temporarily lost in a blizzard of paperwork. In the interim, Reed died. 3 years later, when detectives were looking into Blanche Moore's past, doctors and police finally saw those results. Raymond Reed had been poisoned. It appeared that Blanche was seasoning her dishes with more than just sugar and spice. In North Carolina, investigators suspected that Blanche Moore was a serial poisoner. According to Forsyth County District Attorney Vincent Rabel, Moore had profited from the death of her boyfriend, Raymond Reed.
She got him to put her into his will during the time that he was in the hospital being poisoned. She was almost destitute financially until Mr. Reed died.
Very nice family.
Detectives had only their suspicions to guide them. If Blanche had really poisoned Reed, the evidence was buried with him. Now, investigators literally had to dig for what they needed to make their case.
Until this happened.
Okay.
Yeah, this is...
Though arsenic poisoning is rarely suspected, it is easy to find once you know what to look for. The element lingers in the body long after it's finished its deadly work. The SBI got permission to exhume Reed's body.
Well, the major trail that arsenic leaves is that it doesn't go away. Arsenic binds to the tissues. It's a heavy, described as a heavy metal. It's an element. It's sort of the ideal thing to have to go look for because it will be there.
A large, recently consumed dose of arsenic will show up in stomach x-rays. Another telltale sign can appear as discolored bands running across fingernails and toenails. Reed's body bore these marks. The most accurate way to determine the presence of arsenic in remains is to perform the Reenactment tests. In the medical examiner's office, tissue samples were taken from the body of Reed. The samples were then dissolved in acid, and a copper wire was placed in the resulting solution. If arsenic is present, it will attach to the wire, turning it black. The test was positive. Judging from Reed's hair samples, he had been poisoned for 6 months before he died. Further tests confirmed the diagnosis.
But when we ran the concentrations of arsenic on his tissues, he had very high levels, and certainly in levels that were associated with toxicity, fatal levels, potentially lethal levels.
Investigators now had 2 poisoned men, and one of them was dead. The only link between them was Blanche Moore. To Blanche's friends, this appeared to be a run of bad luck. But to detectives, Blanche seemed very lucky indeed to have dodged suspicion for so long. Once Reed had gone on to his reward, Blanche inherited hers, $80,000. But Reed wasn't necessarily her first victim. Investigators learned that 13 years before Reed's illness, her first husband, James N. Taylor, also died a mysterious, lingering death. His body was exhumed. It, too, tested positive for arsenic poisoning. The pattern was irrefutable. In Blanche's world, it appeared that the way to a man's heart and his money was through his stomach.
Yes.
But Blanche's current husband, Reverend Moore, was even bigger game. His insurance and assets made him worth $250,000 dead. But she couldn't collect it yet. Reverend Moore was still fighting for his life. Doctors usually do not suspect poisoning until it is too late. But unlike Taylor and Reed, Reverend Moore lived to count his blessings. The forensic evidence helped agents follow Blanche's well-worn trail of murder. She lured her victims to their deaths, pretending to nurture them during their moment of need. Blanche kept bringing food to Reed until she killed him.
Hi, sweetheart. I brought you your favorite dessert.
Doubtless, she had planned to serve Reverend Moore the same fate.
Your favorite dessert.
Even though the minister's health no longer hung in the balance, the state's case against his wife certainly did.
Good?
They needed to prove she was a serial poisoner.
thing I've had in a long.
And we were very much concerned that she would weave her web of deceit and charm with the jury and convince them that she was not to blame.
Hi, Mrs. Moore. Hi, Detective.
Starting with her arrest for the murders of James Taylor and Raymond Reed, she refuted all charges, claiming she was the victim of a massive conspiracy.
Not me.
You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have him present with you.
When she took the stand, she denied bringing any food outside the hospital and accused many nurses and doctors of lying about her and accused them of falsifying medical records that were created at the time, which reported that she was feeding the patients food from home.
More than 50 witnesses from several hospitals clearly remembered Blanche's facade of kindness and her culinary largesse. In truth, Blanche had been cooking like a fiend. Her own testimony cued the jury that she was lying. but it took careful forensic analysis of all the evidence to prove it.
Do you want to know a little bit about
Blanche
the
Moore
background?
was convicted of first-degree murder for poisoning Raymond Reed.
Since you've given me all this,
She was also indicted for assault with a deadly weapon upon Reverend Moore.
do you have any?
I am a suspect.
He survived the attack and was soon divorced from his murderous bride. But Blanche Moore was fated to get a dose of her own medicine. The judge sentenced her to death by her choice of poison gas or lethal injection. Because she was already on death row, she wasn't prosecuted for the death of her first husband, James Taylor. "60% of women who kill use poison. It destroys the victim from within, while it preserves the killer's veneer of innocence. But the most subtle murderer is one who never even goes to the scene of the crime." On January 21st, 1992, a difficult land and air search for a missing man near Kinston, North Carolina, came to a gruesome end. Authorities had finally found the body of Billy White, a successful life insurance salesman. He had been gunned down next to his van on a lonely dirt road. The victim's pockets were turned inside out. His wallet was empty. At first glance, robbery appeared to be the motive. State Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Ken Raper was called to the scene. He didn't have much to go on.
It appeared he'd been shot twice, once in the chest and once in his lower left side. It was a shotgun. I thought at the time it was probably double-aught buck or maybe triple-aught buck.
Okay, you have 2 wounds here.
But there were no shell casings at the scene.
What, 20 feet from the victim? Officer, can you please get
The only clue left behind was a single tire track in the mud near the victim's head. It was carefully photographed from all angles for comparison in case a suspect's car was found. Investigators spoke with the victim's wife, Sylvia White. She told them she believed her husband was killed on his way to see a new client.
Businessman.
Sylvia sometimes worked as her husband's secretary. She told police that a man named Timmy Connors had called her about buying a large insurance policy. She had referred Connors to her husband so he could close the sale. It was well known that Billy would drive anywhere to meet a client. His eagerness might have led him to his death.
He was a nice guy, a little bit quiet.
Police
Sort of
interviewed
kept
the
to
victim's
himself, went off a lot
co-workers.
to work with his clients, so he wasn't around that much.
None had ever seen Connors,
Yes, I am. How can I help you?
Excuse me,
and
Artie.
Sylvia's only contact with him had been over the
I
phone.
think Mr. White had the opportunity to talk to him.
It
I
wasn't
know
much to go
Sylvia
on,
White-
but the mysterious client was the only lead police had. The SBI reached out to the community for tips through television and newspaper ads. Before long, an anonymous informant called the police with a tip. He told them that a thin, long-haired carpenter had been soliciting people to murder Billy White. The informant told them the construction site where this person worked, but he didn't know the man's name.
What are you working on?
Investigators went to the construction site, but found no one who matched the description. At the same time, investigators worked with local law enforcement to go through mugshots, hoping to make an ID.
How you doing, Jay? What's going on?
Joe, I need your proofs on these.
Police learned while interviewing members of Sylvia White's family that she had hired a man named Linwood Taylor to do some work for her. Taylor's mugshot matched the description. Investigators also found that he worked at the job site mentioned by the informant. Taylor was called in for questioning. At first, he denied knowing the Whites, but investigators knew that was a lie and told him so. Eventually, he confessed to committing the murder.
Carpentry.
He said the motive was money. He was hired to kill Billy White.
Miss White?
He admitted that the person who planned the whole thing was Sylvia White. SBI agent Eric Smith was present at Taylor's interview.
He said he had known Sylvia White for about a year, and that during that time she had told him stories of her husband's poor treatment. He had abused her and things of that nature. Mr. Taylor said he developed a lot of sympathy for Miss Sylvia White, but at this time when we interviewed him, he said a lot of the stories or scenarios she had given him, he didn't believe any longer.
Taylor alleged that Sylvia had offered him $20,000 and a minivan if he would kill her husband. He said he would do it, but couldn't muster the courage. Sylvia grew impatient. Then she divulged a secret to him.
She basically told him if he couldn't do it, she'd do it herself, that she had done it before, and she had had a stepchild that she felt wasn't right, so she put a bag over its head until it stopped breathing.
The death of Sylvia's stepson 10 years earlier had been attributed to an accident. If Taylor's allegations about Sylvia were true, then the grieving widow would be unmasked as a cold-hearted killer who would stop at nothing to achieve her ends.
She came to me.
Now they had to gather tangible proof that she was involved in the killings.
For what? $3,000.
Yeah, I've got Baskin coming up here. Yeah,
In Taylor's confession, he told police that his uncle, Ernest Basden, was also involved in the murder of Billy White.
Mr. Basden is here.
Hello, Mr. Baskin. Thanks for coming in. Okay. Why don't you have a seat?
Basden was called to the station.
With Mr. Taylor yesterday. And,
At first, he denied killing the insurance
He
salesman.
comes back, and then he
But then, like his
Get in his
nephew,
ring.
he realized that honesty is the best policy. He too confessed to the killing. He told investigators that he had pulled the trigger himself. He had needed the money, Sylvia White's money. Now, police had two independent confessions, and both of them implicated the victim's widow. Her money had paid for her husband's assassins, but it couldn't buy their silence. Agents still had to back up the confessions with solid evidence if they were to build a case against Sylvia White. All they had to link the men to the crime were the tire tracks lifted from the scene. A search warrant was obtained to examine the tires on Linwood Taylor's cars.
They towed a Cutlass and a Camaro, and when I arrived, I walked over and looked at the tire treads, the tires themselves on both vehicles, and then determined that we need to take the ones off of the Camaro, that they indeed were consistent with the tread design that I had observed at the scene that day.
An SBI laboratory examination of his tire treads confirmed that Taylor's car had been at the scene of the murder. Next, detectives went to Taylor's house, where they uncovered treasure among the trash.
At Taylor's house, the crime scene investigators went out, and what they found was a trash pile in the rear where trash had been burned, and they were able to discover the remaining portions of several shotgun shells in the fire. The plastic portion had been burned, destroyed, but the brass casing was still there.
Presumably, these were the spent shells missing from the murder scene. The SBI seized the shells for analysis, but they still didn't have the murder weapon. Taylor and Basden said they had cut up the shotgun with a hacksaw, embedded it in a bucket of cement, and hurled it off a bridge.
We went out to the Neuse River area, and the divers went in the water, and within 5 to 10 minutes, they had located the bucket on the north side of the bridge, just as Mr. Taylor had described, filled with cement.
Now, police literally had concrete evidence to support Taylor's story, but they still had to prove it was the murder weapon. Because it could no longer be fired, similar guns were test-fired at the SBI lab. Ballistic tests verified Taylor's story about the distance from which White had been shot. Taylor and Basden were now firmly implicated. But connections between Sylvia White and the conspiracy were still weak.
Okay, this White. So,
Sylvia had insisted that she didn't know Taylor,
He sounds
and yet
white.
investigators had witnesses who had seen them together.
and what did he take off? Do you have a... Were you aware of him?
Taylor admitted receiving a partial payment of $1,500 from White several days after the murder. Detectives traced the trail of cash back to its source.
A friend of the family and business partner of Mr. White had given Sylvia $1,500 a few days earlier. We were able to locate a bank that had cashed that check, which Miss White had endorsed. Mr. Taylor told us that the money he received was in an envelope, a banking envelope.
It was from the same bank that had cashed Sylvia's check. Taylor also told police that before Sylvia hired him, she had tried to kill her husband herself. She told him she'd read up on poisonous plants at the library. She tried feeding some to him, but they only made him ill. Investigators knew that if they could link Sylvia to books on poisons, they'd be able to prove that she intended to kill her husband.
And this one...
SBI agents went to the library to search for clues. There they found several volumes on poisonous plants. One book had missing pages. According to the index, those pages dealt with water hemlock and poison hemlock, plants common to the area. Agent Smith had the book analyzed for fingerprints.
I told him it was a 50-50 shot, but it was something that we really needed to connect Miss White to this murder. And he collected it, removed it from the library, and sent it to the lab.
A palm print was found inside the book next to the missing pages. A comparison with Sylvia White's print showed a perfect match. Step by step, the State Bureau of Investigation built their case against Sylvia White and her co-conspirators.
The evidence in this case from our SBI laboratory conclusively tied Linwood Taylor's vehicle to the crime scene. The story provided by Sylvia White to Linwood Taylor about Timmy Connors were able to corroborate through interviews. The final item was Sylvia White's palm print in the book on poisonous plants in North Carolina that conclusively tied her to the book.
The collected evidence positively implicated Sylvia White in the death of her husband. As the forensic evidence was pieced together, the full conspiracy came out. Basden said that his nephew, Linwood Taylor, had approached him about the murder at a party in October of the previous year. But the offer fell on deaf ears until Basden fell on hard times. In January, he agreed to do the job for money. Taylor, posing as Tim Connors, had already established a phone rapport with Billy White. Counting on the insurance salesman's willingness to go anywhere to clinch a deal, Taylor lured his victim to the remote dirt road.
Tim Connors.
Oh, okay. All right.
There, Basden ambushed White and pulled the trigger. They took the salesman's cash and collected the spent shell casings. Then, they fled to Taylor's house, where they burned the shells and their clothing. But there was still more evidence to destroy. Taylor sawed the shotgun into pieces and embedded them in the cement. Then they ditched the gun in the river. That done, Taylor and Basden thought they were in the clear, but investigators caught up with them, and with Sylvia White. The case against the widow was now solid, but even so, Sylvia White may have gotten away with murder after all, at least so far. To strengthen their case against her, the SBI checked Taylor's story that Sylvia had smothered her stepson 10 years earlier.
We exhumed the body and transported it to Chapel Hill, and the results of that medical examination revealed injuries to young Billy White that had been sustained prior to his death, for which there was no documented medical treatment. One of those injuries was a fracture to the skull.
A plastic bag was also found in the child's windpipe. The victim was clearly murdered. Before the trial for her husband's murder commenced, Sylvia White was convicted of the murder of her stepson. She received a life sentence. But she wasn't out of the woods. With Linwood Taylor's confession and the forensic evidence that backed it up, Sylvia White had no defense. In 1993, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of her husband, and was sentenced to another life term plus 10 years. Linwood Taylor and Ernest Basden also were convicted of first-degree murder. Taylor got life. For pulling the trigger, Basden was sentenced to death. Sylvia White took a business-like approach to killing her husband. She hired someone else to do the work for her, leaving herself one step removed. Blanche Moore and Barbara Stagger had other techniques for distancing themselves from their crimes. Blanche Taylor Moore posed as the nurturing figure as she fed poison to her victims. And Barbara Stagger killed through feigned incompetence, staging her murders to look like tragic accidents. In each case, forensics told a different story. Women may not be as outwardly violent as men, but they can be as effectively lethal. Police are just now starting to notice it. But whether a killing is stealthy or obvious, discreet or bloody, when forensic science is brought to bear on the case, the odds of bringing a female murderer to justice are equally good.